evening. A warm welcome once again at Hyde Park. We thought of bringing to you a special edition of the Current Affairs program given the aftermath of the Easter Sunday attacks as we mark 1 week of the horrific attacks here in Colombo, Batticaloa and Negombo. We thought of discussing the way forward and to discuss the movement that took Sri Lanka by shock. Of course, to discuss this, we've invited an expert, the foremost Sri Lankan expert on terrorism and political violence and the author of Inside Al-Qaeda, Global Network of Terror. This was in 2003, and also a prominent book that links the Al-Qaeda, the IS movement and its work spreading to Asia. But before I introduce to you and mention the book to you, I'd like to warmly welcome to you Professor Rohan Gunaratna. Good evening, a warm welcome.
Good evening.
Professor Gunaratna, you flew into Sri Lanka immediately after the attacks.
That's correct.
What brings you to Sri Lanka?
I want to see for myself the attack sites. I also wanted to discuss with government and others who were mounting operations and also discuss the strategy, how we can secure Sri Lanka from a persistent threat the country is facing at this point from the Islamic State.
This is the first television interview you're giving out during your stay, and we're thankful to that. I'd like to talk a little about your book. You wrote this book titled in 2004, Forecasting, Predicting the Spread of Islamic State to Asia. You've also interviewed fighters in Iraq, and this is something we'd like to talk about, especially because this is a new wave of terrorism, extremism that Sri Lanka is experiencing. This is still new to Sri Lanka, although there have been intelligence information. Let's start off here. Soon after you flew into Sri Lanka, even before IS fighters pledged their support or took support or responsibility, I repeat, their responsibility of these attacks in Sri Lanka, you did mention that these attacks were carried out by the IS. How do you come into this conclusion?
I have studied IS since 2014, when IS proclaimed a caliphate, that is on the 29th of June 2014. And I was also in Iraq interviewing IS members. I also wrote the first article on the spread of IS into Asia, because no one believed that the threat will come to Asia. And that article was published in 2015. And I want to share with you that IS has mounted attacks in many countries around Sri Lanka, in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, in India, in Bangladesh. In Southeast Asia, they have mounted attacks in Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines. In fact, in May of 2018, that is just last year, 3 churches were attacked, and there were family suicide, entire family mounted attacks. And on the 27th of January this year, 2019, we saw a beautiful cathedral in Philippines was again attacked by IS man and woman. So we are seeing a trend of attacks against churches.
The rise of Islamic State, terrorism's new phase in Asia. Now, I'd like to turn to the beginning of your book that you authored in 2015, Predicting IS Movement and its Spread to Asia. Did you forecast or did you see these attacks coming to Sri Lanka?
We have observed a heavy build-up of radicalization in Sri Lanka. There were 6 Tawhid organizations. These are cult groups. And one of these cult groups was of special interest. That is the group where Zahran was the spokesperson. That is the National Tawhid Jamaat.
That's the organization that the government has pinned the blame and responsibility for these attacks.
Yes, but I disputed that, and I said that this attack was not mounted by National Tawhid Jamaat. and I said that this attack has been carried out by the Islamic State. In fact, the Islamic State created a specialized branch in Sri Lanka called Jamiatul Millati Ibrahim Fi Selani, and that is the name of the organization that was founded by IS in Sri Lanka. And there were total of 41 Sri Lankans fighters and families that traveled to Syria and Iraq, and the leader of this group, Nilam, was killed in Syria, and after that there was another leader called Umiya, and after that Zahran took over the organization.
You mentioned that you dispute the government's claims that the National Tawhid Jamaat organization is responsible for these horrific attacks in Sri Lanka, and I'm sorry I didn't get the name of the organization that you just mentioned, but you say they're responsible for these attacks, and they're an affiliate of the ISIS, the Islamic State, their Sri Lankan branch. But how would you say that these two organizations are not linked?
The National Tawhid Jamaat only produce radicals, but the radicals are recruited by the Islamic State. In fact, Zahran was in the National Tawhid Jamaat. He fought with the president of that organization. There was a riot, and there were 2 warrants of arrest issued for Zahran. So he left that organization. That is the National Tawhid Jamaat. And then he broke away and created his own group with others who are radical and who wanted to mount attacks. And that organization is called Jamiatul Millati Ibrahim Fi Silani. And that is the group that was co-opted by the Islamic State to mount the attacks.
I'd like to take a look at the video which was released on the official Islamic State social media and website. Here's a look at the video where these attackers pledged their support.
نبايع أمير المؤمنين وخليفة المسلمين الشيخ أبا بكر البغدادي القرشي الحسيني على السمع والطاعة في المنشط والمكره وفي العسر واليسر وعلى أثرة علينا وألا ننازع الأمر أهله إلا أن نرى كفرا بواحا عندنا من الله فيه برهان والله على ما نقول شهيد. تكبير تكبير تكبير.
Could you explain to us what this video is, since you've studied extensively on IS work?
Anyone who joins the Islamic State, they have to take an oath of allegiance to the leader of that group, that is Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. And that is a video where they have taken an oath of allegiance to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. So those who believe in the ideology of the Islamic State, their leader is not the leader of Sri Lanka, but their leader is the leader that is currently operating in Iraq and Syria, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. And I want to share with you the genesis of this organization. The founder father of the Islamic State is a man called Abu Musab az-Zakawi, and Zahran emulated Abu Musab az-Zakawi. Zakawi came from Jordan with his mentor Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi, and they established a training camp in Afghanistan with funding from Osama bin Laden. And in 2001, after the US intervention in Afghanistan following 9/11, Abu Musab az-Zakawi moved through Iran, Mashhad and Tehran into the north of Iraq and created an organization called Tawhid wal Jihad, very similar to the organization that Zahran was a member. And Tawhid wal Jihad in Iraq evolved into Al-Qaeda in Iraq, into the Mujahideen Shura Council, into the Islamic State of Iraq, Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. And on the 29th of June 2000 2014, this group became the Islamic State or the Dawla Islamia. It is at that point that in Sri Lanka, Zahran and his associates that founded the organization, the branch of the Islamic State in Sri Lanka called Jamiatul Millati Ibrahim Silani.
Professor Gunaratna, we're talking about the Islamic State and their ideology, but we'd like to understand this here in Sri Lanka. What do they really want?
The ideology of the Islamic State is to make the entire world Islamic and get people to follow the Islamic law, the Sharia law, but their version of Sharia law. And my own view is that this does not blend well to Sri Lanka, because Sri Lanka is a pluralist society, multi-ethnic, multi-religion, and that is so important for everyone to understand that in this country they cannot impose their own religion. They must create a religious atmosphere where there is moderation, toleration and coexistence. But in the case of the Islamic State, they want to convert everyone in Sri Lanka to Islam, and that is not practical. And that is why they attack Sri Lanka. The reason they attack Sri Lanka is that they had a deep hatred against these other faiths that are in Sri Lanka, and they received very clear instructions. The Islamic State branch in Sri Lanka received very clear instructions to attack hotels, to kill Westerners, because these Western nations had dismantled IS in Iraq and Syria, and to attack the churches.
But why churches?
There has been
because the majority religion and the population is Buddhist.
There is a systematic pattern of seeking revenge and avenging the loss of the physical caliphate in Iraq and Syria. That is why IS staged the attacks in May 2018 in Indonesia against the churches, and January 2019 in the Philippines. And immediately after that, of course, they had decided also to attack the churches in Sri Lanka. The Islamic State ideology identifies as its enemies Christians and Western countries. They call them crusaders. And of course, other religions.
Professor Gunaratna, again, we're trying to really understand what they want here in Sri Lanka. As you say, they want to spread what they believe in and make Sri Lanka also a part of their faith. But how did Sri Lanka miss this? Because we're talking about you're talking about an extremist movement, that you knew that there was an extremist movement coming into Asia, and Sri Lanka was very much vulnerable to these attacks. Yes, we had intelligence information, but why do you think it wasn't taken very seriously?
Sri Lankans have island mentality, and they believe that IS will not affect them. And their main focus was the Tamil Tigers. Sri Lankan security forces are very capable. We have one of the best militaries, best law enforcement agencies, and the best intelligence services, because for 27 years these three entities fought terrorism. But after the LTT was defeated in 2009, there was a change in thinking that the threat had diminished. The security and intelligence platform that existed was dismantled.
That Sri Lanka became complacent about the security situation?
Absolutely. And that is why IS ceded its presence here. Previous to that, hither to that, IS was operating here more as a propaganda entity. But only after the security and intelligence platform was dismantled, IS was able to grow. People continue to travel to Syria and Iraq. People continue to recruit, have encrypted communication, and start even training camps and training facilities. There were many alarm bells, but in general, the apex leadership of the security and intelligence community did not act seriously.
How significant is this Sri Lankan attack for Islamic State?
It is very significant because Islamic State suffered very significantly in the month of January and February in Syria and Iraq. This group was virtually dismantled because the American-led coalition, the Russian-led coalition, and the other forces managed to contain, isolate, and eliminate the territorial control of IS. And with the battle space shrinking in Iraq and Syria, IS has entered a new phase of global expansion with attacks in Africa, in the Middle East, in the Caucasus, and in Asia. So during this phase, Sri Lanka and other countries must be exceptionally alert and vigilant to dismantle this network. This is a pipeline that produces terrorists. Fighting terrorism is not going and just killing or catching terrorists. It is, the strategy should be to dismantle that pipeline of radicalization, of taking an innocent Muslim who doesn't understand this phenomenon, radicalizing him with exclusivist ideas, not to associate with non-Muslims, and eventually peaking his radicalization to a point where he is willing to kill and die. And that structure must be dismantled.
As you say, that structure must be dismantled. De-radicalization. What should Sri Lanka be doing now? How do we de-radicalize these people? You spoke to several IS fighters in Iraq. I'm sure you have a lot of understanding on how they think, what their next move will be.
Sri Lanka did a brilliant job when it launched its rehabilitation program to de-radicalize and mainstream 12,000 Tamil Tigers. None of them returned back to violence because the program was very effective. We had religious rehabilitation, religious and spiritual rehabilitation, social and family rehabilitation, recreational rehabilitation, creative arts in rehabilitation. We had psychological rehabilitation, financial rehabilitation. So those who went to the extreme were taken back to the mainstream and released. Similarly, Sri Lanka should build a similar program, but parallel to that, it is vital for Sri Lanka to pass a National Security Act. The reason Zahran could not be brought to justice is because Zahran for a long period operated as an extremist. And the laws in this country are exceptionally weak to bring to justice those preachers of hate, those who incite others to violence. So there must be, within that National Security Act, 4 elements. One is a law called maintenance of ethnic and religious harmony. Anyone who insults another person's religion should be charged, investigated. Second is, a lot of Zahran's activity was in cyberspace. Cyberspace should be regulated. That means anyone posting extremist content on cyberspace should be investigated and should be fined. And if ISPs, if the internet service providers and also tech companies like Facebook keep this extremist content too long, they should also be punished. They should be fined, the executives jailed if they are not willing to act. And the third is the radical preachers who are coming to Sri Lanka. We should ensure that all of them are screened and to make sure that they have not insulted anyone's religion, they have not affiliated themselves either with Al-Qaeda or IS or any other terror group. And the Sri Lankan preachers themselves, they should be certified by the Ministry of Religious Affairs as people with the right understanding of Islam. And if they violate that, there should be criminal charges laid against them. Because for me, a radical ideologue is a bigger threat than operational terrorists. So there must be a system that is created to handle this matter. I would advocate one other thing. Our national education system is not really national. We have Muslim schools, Christian schools, Buddhist schools, and Hindu schools. We should have national schools, what you call the Bahujatika Pasal, where we produce Sri Lankans. At this point, we are not doing that. So I make a plea to government, please consider having a National Security Act that addresses all these strategic issues. For the government forces to go and catch or kill Zahran's network is the easiest thing that we have been doing for 27 years. The biggest challenge the leaders of this country should face today is to create that strategic counterterrorism framework where we will not be producing terrorists and extremists every few months and attacks every few years.
Professor Gunaratna, you did mention that we need to come up with strong national laws to prevent these acts. Sri Lanka, a country which had strong laws, the Prevention of Terrorism Act, we're talking about, if I'm not mistaken, on this very program, we had a legal expert analyze a section subsection 1H, where it says that under that subsection, anyone could be arrested on the suspicion of extremist or terrorist attacks. But over the years, these laws have been, and powers have been diluted. How do we go from here? If we speak about the structure itself, on strengthening the structure of law enforcement authorities, where do you think the power should be? How do you think we should execute these in terms of combating extremist terrorists?
If you take a pyramid, the terrorists are only right at the apex, just 1%. But about 40% of them are extremists and the balance are all exclusivist. I'll give you a good example. In Islam, there is a phrase called al-wala wal-bara, meaning loyalty to good things and hatred to bad things. But Zahran's group and their members misinterpreted al-wala wal-bara by saying it is loyalty to fellow Muslims and hatred to non-Muslims. So Islam is a very peaceful religion, but Islam is being misinterpreted and misrepresented. And to bring such people to justice, we need a robust law that criminalizes incitement to violence, incitement to hatred. We cannot rely on the existing laws of this nation. It is not explicit and not robust enough. That is why I said that we need to look at the changing threat landscape and look at the new threat actors that are using religion and ethnicity to radicalize others. Once we do that, Sri Lanka will be a much safer place.
Finally, you authored the book Inside Al-Qaeda, a global network of terror in 2003. I mentioned that at the beginning of our discussion. And then in 2015, you had a forecast into the spread of Islamic State in Asia through your book From the Desert to World Cities, The New Terrorism. Where do we go from here? What do you think Islamic State is doing now? What will be their next step, according to your understanding?
The Islamic State wants to radicalize the Sri Lankan Muslim population. Hitherto, the Sri Lankan Muslim population has been a model Muslim community because they work with the government to fight against the Tamil Tigers that ethnically cleanse the Muslims from the north, that attack Muslim villages in the east, that attack the Mira Juma and the Husseiniya mosques. The Muslims suffered, and brilliant Muslim officers worked with the Sri Lankan government. Colonel Nizam Mutalif, who headed the military intelligence, the father of the special forces, Colonel Fasli Lafir. So the Muslims have been very much aligned with the national policies of this country. And in the face of the IS threat to Sri Lanka, it is imperative for the Sri Lankan political leaders to work with the Muslim community. I recently spoke to the Muslim leaders and I told them that today the responsibility is on you to protect your community, meaning in the mosque, in the madrasas, educate the Muslim children that if they see anyone speaking of any radical ideology, anyone thinking and planning attacks, immediately to inform the authorities. And I believe that the most important thing today for for the Sri Lankan government and the Sri Lankan people is to build a very close relationship with the Muslim community, because less than 1% of the Muslims support extremism and support terrorism. And I can also tell you that today most Muslims are with the government, and we must not overreact to this situation. We must build strong bridges with the Muslim community, but we cannot allow the extremist preachers to come to our country. We cannot allow extremist preachers in our country to go and preach around. We cannot allow the beautiful traditional and local Islam in Sri Lanka to be replaced by some Middle Eastern Islam. So the Muslim leaders must take this responsibility seriously, and they must prevent the next attack. If they are not going to do that, their own community will be damaged.
Are we to be worried about any attacks regionally or any threat to the region, because Sri Lanka is a strong strategic location regionally, but Sri Lanka was attacked?
The Islamic State is spreading very rapidly in this region, in India, in the Maldives, in Pakistan, in Afghanistan. A province of the Islamic State, the Caliphate, has already been declared in South Asia. And when such a province is declared, the Islamic State will invest in cyberspace to radicalize more youth. That is why I had proposed certain strategic measures to counter this threat. This is Sri Lanka's moment to build the Sri Lankan nation, to make every Sri Lankan community resilient against extremism and terrorism. The real challenge to this country is not terrorism. Our security forces, law enforcement agencies and intelligence services are very capable to deal with that threat. Where we need the capability is our leaders to build a strategic framework to fight exclusivism and extremism that leads to terrorism. Terrorism is a vicious byproduct of extremism and exclusivism. No terrorist is born overnight. Zaharan operated in Sri Lanka for a long time. He was first known to government in 2010. And I want to tell you, but we did not develop the appropriate legislation, the tools to fight an organization like this. It is high time for us to do it.
Thank you for your insights, Professor Rohan Gunaratna. I hope your aim of flying into Sri Lanka so immediately after the attacks were achieved, and you were able to speak with authorities and give them some insight into what's happening globally and your thoughts on what measures should be taken here in Sri Lanka.
Thank you very much.
We had with us Professor Rohan Gunaratna, the foremost Sri Lankan expert on terrorism and political violence, also the author of Inside Al-Qaeda, Global Network of Terror in year 2003, and the author of From the Desert to World Cities, The New Terrorism in year 2015. Thank you for joining us at Hyde Park.